So, you want to save the world with clean energy? Make money doing it? Confused about the economic and technical realities of residential and commercial solar, batteries, heat pumps, EVs? Want the real-world scoop on new energy technologies, not manufacturer hype? Then tune in to the Weekly Energy Show, hosted by Barry Cinnamon. Insights from Barry's 40-plus years in the solar and energy industry will help you understand the future ways we'll generate and consume energy. And now, here's Barry.
Welcome to this week's Energy Show. Now, the OBBB, or One Beautiful Bill, is now law in the United States. And what that means for people in the solar and the battery storage industry is that it eliminates that 30% tax credit that's been in effect since 2008 for residential solar. And it adds restrictions to the tax credits, 30 or 40%, for commercial solar. And it's important to note that residential leases and power purchase agreements are considered commercial installations. So those are still around, but it's going to be a little tricky. So effectively, the price for a cash and a loan purchase of solar is going to go up 30% on January 1st, 2026. Solar leasing is more complicated. That's still going to be out there for at least another couple of years. And there's a lot of funky rules, domestic content rules, safe harboring considerations, this thing called foreign entity of concern issues that complicate the product availability for financing starting now, certainly extended over the next few years. So every solar contractor I know in the United States, from utility scale down to two guys in a truck, are working like crazy to get systems installed by the end of the year. And I think 2025 is going to be a record year for solar and battery installations. So the smart companies now are planning for 2026. And that raises two questions. What should solar contractors do to succeed in 2026 and beyond? And what should solar and battery customers, homeowners, consider when evaluating products and services? So I'm asking friends in the industry, people that really are going to be in the know. And this week's guest is Dan Fadden. Dan's co-founder and director of shared services at GreenTech Renewables. Now, GreenTech Renewables and CED, their related company, I believe they're the largest distributors of solar and battery equipment. And there's no secret that I believe, and I tell my friends, that distributors like GreenTech can dramatically improve a solar installer's efficiency, cash flow, and ultimately profitability. So prior to GreenTech, Dan was at the parent company of CED for 18 years, and I used to work with CED also. So he knows a lot about supply chains and distribution, and he's got a really good crystal ball when it comes to product, services, and logistics. So welcome to the show, Dan.
Thank you for having me, Barry. Appreciate the strong intro.
Well, it's just, it's your background and it's the company, and, it's really important to set the stage. So first, tell us a little bit about how you and your team built CED GreenTech and, now GreenTech Renewables.
Well, we're really an organic growth story. So we dipped our toes in the water of solar back in, about 2010. And it was really in response to the housing market crash. My business, my electrical distribution business, was off about 40% in a given year. And so we were scrambling to, from a defensive perspective, to find new things to sell. And solar was one of the markets that we identified as having some potential. And so, a handful of us around the country started to dabble around in this sort of on our own. It was fairly, bottoms up entrepreneurial effort. Did a couple of years, in the salt mines to understand it and start to work with customers and understand the technology. And we became increasingly convinced that we thought the products were going to get better, cheaper, faster, like a lot of things silicon based, right? It sort of was following that Moore's law idea, not exactly, but sort of analogously. That said, we were fortunate enough to get relationships set up with Enphase and Iron Ridge and some other early suppliers that saw the value of distribution, and started to scale and add solar products to our line card in markets where it made sense to do so. And we did that for it was about a 4-year effort of, I would call it, experimentation. After which, we're on that hockey stick of growth, right? The whole market was pretty explosive during that, early 2010, 2012 kind of era. And the company gave us the leash and the bandwidth financially to take some risk and to manage it. We put a great team on the field. And we just created a blueprint to basically add solar into electrical distribution businesses, and then ultimately broke those businesses away from the corporate structure because the market's very different. The customers for solar, we found, were not necessarily going to be electrical contractors. They were going to be solar installers that sort of had their own buying mechanisms, and the dynamics of the market were going in that direction. So we broke it off. It's been a great story. To this day, we've grown pretty much every year. We had a little setback like everybody else did in 2023, but it's been a good story. We're up to 100 and I think 105 locations around the country now, mostly in markets where you'd anticipate having solar, but in some markets where you wouldn't anticipate having solar. It's a pretty politically, I would say, bipartisan issue these days. So we have red states, we got purple states, we got blue states, and that's been, like I said, it's been a good story.
All right. All right. Well, and I think a lot of those states are in a state of confusion. So that leads to the questions that we ask. What should solar contractors do to succeed in 2026 and beyond? Let's start off with that.
Well, I'll tell you how we're thinking about it internally. One of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to parse the markets into sort of intellectual baskets, if you will, right? For example, a high cost of power market, like a Southern California or Hawaii or Northeast U.S., and you have access to TPO financing in those states, your market looks a lot different next year than, let's say, you're in a low cost of power market where third party ownership is not feasible, right? And I don't want to name any states, but I don't want to single anybody out, right? But you get expensive power and you got TPO, you've got a really different look into next year than if you don't, and if you have cheap power. So that said, we see the market next year looking sort of like a checkerboard, right? You're going to have some really good patches where we think the market's going to hold up relatively well. And then we have some areas of concern where, 25D had been the primary driver, and maybe loan financing or cash financing with 25D support was a big purchase driver for our installers, in a market where they had 12-cent power, right? Those markets, the installers have a lot of homework to do there. They've got to reassess their sales strategies, and I'll get into more detail on some of this stuff in a minute, right? But you got to look at everything. Because the market is super unlikely to hold up in its present rate. And then, like I said, it's a very different look in some of the more robust markets. And there's a lot of markets in between, right? Where you've got maybe 18-cent power and access to TPO, it's that, or you've got, 22-cent power and no TPO, but, you get pretty good economics or a relatively quick ROI payback relatively with solar. So all these things are different. So we can't look at the market as sort of one universe, right? It's a whole bunch of pockets. And so we're challenging our management teams to get into their local markets and do this homework and start to break this stuff out as they forecast into next year. And then obviously collaborate with their customers that really have to assimilate all this change and all this homework into business plans that they're going to take to the market and do something with.
Yeah, that's exactly kind of the way we're looking at it. We're a little bit fortunate to be in Silicon Valley. It's an expensive market. Power is expensive. We got plenty of sun, and it's relatively affluent, so it helps. But boy, I talk to friends all around the country, and it is very difficult to downsize a business. If you're running a $3 million or a $30 million or a $300 million, I think almost the bigger the business gets, the harder it is to downsize. And we're all going to have to look at those things very, very carefully. So, what are some of the specific things that you suggest installers modify or do?
Well, I think this is probably, I don't know how popular this is going to be, but I'm going to say it because it's obvious. And people who know me know that I'll say the quiet part out loud. But look, I think we as an industry have been challenged with pretty high cost of customer acquisition, right? And how we pay salespeople, I think, is got to be looked at, right? And when solar essentially just got 30% more expensive, as you said in your intro. That's sort of the right way to think about it. And, where are the biggest layers in the cost stack that are potentially going to contravene that? And I think with few exceptions, most people would look at that cost of customer acquisition as something that probably needs to shrink. It's unlikely to come from material cost because with the tariff situation we have and the FEOC situation, all the complexity around trying to domesticate the solar supply chain, which is an ongoing, that's not a new thing. That's been happening for like the last 6 years behind the scenes. The government's been really consistent about trying to pitchfork our manufacturers to bring capacity here. The products are unlikely to get that much cheaper. I mean, outside of, I think energy storage has still got a down leg. It gets cheaper and better every year, which is great. I don't see the rest of the product set getting cheap enough to offset a large percentage of that 30% total install cost. So the biggest piece is that customer acquisition piece. And then if you get past that, we try to coach our installers to be very overhead light. And this is going to be me talking my book, right? So I'm just going to shamelessly kind of pitch, our value prop as a distributor.
Go for it, because it's gold.
All right, so I have to be in warehouses, right? And I have to have truck. I'm a distributor. That's my business. So I have to take a lot of fixed expense risk to resource, 100 locations and all the people to operate them and all the inventory we have to support customers. We coach customers, you don't necessarily have to take that risk. You don't have to go out and lease, at $20 a square foot, a 20,000 square foot warehouse that you got to pay lease expense on now for the next, 10 years. That is fixed cost risk that you don't need to take if you can sort of use my warehouse, right? Maybe we can do job site delivery for you. Maybe we can kit jobs and deliver them to you in bulk in a much smaller warehouse. So you don't have to take inventory risk. You don't have to take exposure on payroll that you don't need. And look, obviously I'm talking my book, right? But it's not just me. There are other quality distributors out there other than us. And I think we have, our value prop's a little different. I have more warehouses than others, but everyone sort of warehouses stuff, and they have smart people that stay close to, how to service customers and how to save, our customers money. That said, if it's not us, maybe it's somebody else. But I think running through the value prop of distribution, like with a P&L, with your P&L in hand, and say, what line items can I cross off if I partner more closely with a trusted distributor, is a worthy exercise. I think the obvious pushback is then, well, I'm going to pay maybe more for my material, which could be true with modules at times. It tends not to be as true with other components because we can generally negotiate special price agreements for other components. But even with modules, do you really want to take inventory risk? A lot of people lost a lot of money taking a lot of inventory at the end of 2022, and module prices came off 40% and people lost 40%. We're protected from some of that stuff as a distributor because I've got a lot of turnover. We don't tend to sit on inventory for long periods of time. So I think it's cost effective to risk shift that back to your distributor and expect them to basically protect you from price movement, especially if you're taking delivery of material relatively in real time. Like, you don't have to sit on a lot of risk there. And then beyond that, I'm not worried about excess inventory in this cycle. I am worried about FIAC compliant and domestic content compliant material. I think, there's a lot of that needs to get clarified. Like the one big beautiful bill is not entirely settled in the sense that there's an executive order sitting out there. We've got to get clarity on that. What does that mean for tax equity? And then what does it mean for FIAC? I have a conference call with our lawyers today trying to get some clarity on FIAC. When that is clear, people who've taken strong inventory positions or like deep inventory positions in ahead of that are basically in a risk situation. And so the whole idea that I'm going for here is it's hard enough being an installer, right? Like managing crews, selling in home, doing quality work, keeping your customers happy. That's a full-time job. If you get into logistics management and sort of regulatory management and FIAC compliance, that really should be somebody else's job. I think we do it all over the country. I've got teams that do nothing but that, and it's really hard for us to stay on top of it. And we get the best sources and we spend all kinds of money on it. I wouldn't wish that upon my customers. I see that as our job as a player in the industry to make that simpler and to de-risk our customers.
I tell you the example that I use with friends who kind of say, well, I can buy modules cheaper. It's like, I got stacks and stacks of various flavors of LG modules going back 3 or 4 years. I got 5 of the 340s. I got 10 of the 375s. I got 2 left of the 425s, which were great. That's just dead inventory. I'm going to have to liquidate it, and it's going to be hard. And it's a great thing about distribution is because we kind of go through everything as we use it. I don't have to rent more warehouse space. And we got a 6,000 square foot warehouse. There's no way we would be able to do our level of business right now if I had containers come in and figure that out. And the warehouse is busy enough just having pallets come in and out as CED delivers it. So really subtle differences there. And those numbers don't pop out on a financial statement. You kind of really have to dig into it and see. And it's just like suddenly, when we started really working a lot with CD, it's like, hey, our cash balance is going up. That's a really good thing.
It's like magic. We try to articulate that. We have some curriculum where we sort of put the customers that can hold their nose and sort of listen to us on this. We've got a whole, financial model, and it takes a little bit of patience to get through it. And we have to do it in a way that's, we have to be a consultant, not pitching, not like hard selling it, right? But I'd say with very few exceptions, even some of the largest customers, so we can actually sit down and do the analysis with them. It rings true that we de-risk them and save them money if you can look at it holistically. I think, one thing that's been a counter trend on this is, look, people were chasing valuations when the market, every installer out there was going to go public and they're all going to be the next SunPower, until SunPower, had their demise, right? So I think people coming to grips with reality that, look, the best installation companies in many cases are going to be local, family run, probably like generational type businesses, right? And they're going to look a lot more like construction trade businesses, right? Where you've got like this loyal following of customers, you're servicing a market really, really well, you're working on referrals, you're probably even hiring via referrals, right? So it's sort of a local sort of kernel, in the environment. And, in that environment, without the expectations of compound 60% growth rates as far as the eye can see and going public, in 18 months, I think that it sort of has people revisit their expectations about what a distributor can do for them in that environment, because it's a lot easier to make money if you don't have to take all that big risk.
Well, it's easier coming back to customer acquisition costs when you're this older generational, modestly growing company. You have good referrals and you get a lot of recommendations from referrals, including employees that just come to you and say, hey,
Right.
I want to work with you. Let's talk a little bit, and we don't have to go into too much detail if you're not comfortable with it, but let's talk a little bit about supply and demand over the next 6 to 12 months and what impact you think that's going to have on pricing.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we're going to sort of sort things into a couple of baskets, okay? I think that what we're likely to see, and we're seeing some of this already, is with the move from 40% domestic content required to 45 that came out of the bill, there's sort of a run on those low percentage compliant modules, right? And based on the way the NREL tables, and I know some of this is complex, and hopefully most listeners they're somewhat familiar with what I'm saying, but to get the domestic content right, you have to use the NREL tables, and you get X% out of your module, X% out of your racking, X%. Well, when you went to 45, it pushed everybody into, just by mathematical requirement, into sort of 1% or fractional 1% modules. There's only very limited supply on that. That is essentially putting demand pressure on that particular product segment that's fairly acute right now. Now, because some of that's people are going to want to safe harbor that, for TPOs. So there's some TPOs that want to buy that stuff and set it aside to take advantage of safe harboring for the next couple of years.
So backing up, so those would be modules that are TPO compliant? Or
TPO compliant,
okay.
Yeah. And sort of overnight, this wasn't as big a problem until the big, beautiful bill got done and then almost retroactively required 45%. It wasn't quite retro, but it was, from our perspective, it was, because I would have bought all that stuff 2 months earlier and had it from my customers had I known that was coming. Now, we did respond to the best of our ability to do so, but it's not easy for these manufacturers to just suddenly use a domestic junction box or use domestic backsheet or frames in order to get that fractional 1%. They're trying, and they're pivoting hard right now, and there's a handful of them that are doing it, but that's kind of a moving picture right now. And so some of that stuff is going to get in relatively short supply. Like I said, we're trying to stay ahead of that. So, short supply means, escalating prices. That's just sort of supply demand. So I do expect some of that stuff to go up in price. Depending on how fiat comes out, and this probably won't get clarified for another 4, 5, 6 weeks. I'm hoping by RE Plus time we have really good guidance on this, because we're going to see a zillion customers in that show, and I'd like to give them really good guidance. There may be pockets of material that have a fiat advantage that we may see some up price pressure on. I think that there's some apprehension and fear around prices escalating into the close of this year, because 25D deadlines are going to get triggered, at the end of this year. At least from a financing perspective, a lot of the loan providers are starting to shut off originations on those products now, because but what they don't want is salespeople maybe whether they're being nefarious or totally clean of conscience, to go in and sell a homeowner, hey, you're going to get your tax credit this year, have some kind of a delay in permitting or some kind of a problem, not get that system done on the rooftop on time, and have that homeowner then have a problem, and then the lender has to deal with that reconciliation after the fact, right? So there's sort of a known cutoff of originations of sort of your high dealer fee REAM type loan products that's sort of a predicated on 25D expectation. We're already seeing some lenders pull out of those products. So a lot of the sales effort that would go into getting systems closed by the end of this year for 25D compliance, I think a lot of that sales pressure is sort of behind us. Not entirely. We've probably got another 3 or 4 weeks of that, but then that's going to roll over pretty quickly. Then it's going to be about safe harboring stuff that's going to potentially suck product out of the market. And that is really going to be contingent upon the executive order. What you got to define, commence construction. There's a lot. I don't want to get way into the weeds on that, but anybody who's looked at it, it's like, oh my gosh, this is complex, right? So once we see that, we're going to know, is there going to be other pressure points sort of in the inventory stack where suddenly those products are going to get in short supply because they help people solve a safe harbor problem that is going to become the priority going into Q3 and Q4. So I know I'm not giving a lot of hard answers here, right? But this is sort of the playing field. And I think once we get some fiat clarity and we get executive order clarity, a lot of these pieces, like we're hovering over the puzzle right now. We know where all the pieces go, right? But once that guidance is in place, we can snap the puzzle together and have a really good view of what needs to happen.
Yeah. And I just, I have lots of these discussions with people, and I basically say anybody who says they know exactly what's going to happen, I kind of lose a little bit of confidence in their recommendations because it is just so dynamic and uncertain. I hate to use that word, but that's the case.
No, you're right. That's actually maybe one of the better pieces of advice we could probably agree on is if you're getting absolute advice from someone who says they know, boy, I find that highly suspect. I think we have some of the best sources in the world. I mean, we spend a lot of time on this, and I'm going to tell you straight up, I don't know. I know what, I get the if then else cascade, right? If this, then this, then this, that I can see clearly, but the ifs on the front side are not answered yet. And so people who say they know for sure are probably not a great source right now.
Yeah. Coincidental, I saw a blog from one of your associates, Alex Atmore, talking about this, and that was really, really good. If anybody can kind of dig up.
Oh, Alex is great. Yeah, Alex puts those gems out every so often. He's a super talented guy. I read him myself. He does great work. And, he does that on his own. He's got his own network, and he's got a great mind. He's very inquisitive. I love his stuff. I read it every time he puts it out.
Yeah. All right. So let's back up a little bit from a perspective of a solar contractor. What kind of financial structuring, cash, debt, loan advice do you have for solar installers right now?
Well, oh boy. Well, from a corporate balance sheet perspective for installers,
just general, what should you be thinking about?
All right. So it's not like it was 3 years ago, right? Where there was a lot of private equity chasing a lot of the larger to medium sized. And so like that market's, it's turnaround pricing, right? So if you're going to go out and you're going to get outside money, it's not going to give you a valuation that you're going to like. I think the market is viewed by investors as transient and maybe somewhat distressed at the moment because look, cash flow has been tight. It didn't help that a couple prominent TPO players, went bankrupt, and it's left a lot of people in sort of difficult cash flow and balance sheet situations. That's not a secret in the tax equity markets and with the private credit people. They're very smart, they're very well informed, they kind of know what's happening. So valuations aren't great. So, to me, private equity might make sense for somebody who's in a truly desperate situation. I don't really want to say that out loud, but it's kind of true because I think that the long-term fundamentals of our market are awesome. Utility rates are only going to go higher. The data farms and the need for AI and electricity, that is all good stuff. It's all going to happen. The repatriation of manufacture, all this stuff is demand side going to drive electricity prices up no matter what. In an environment where macro, if you can back up and look at a 6-year chart as opposed to a 6-month chart, prices are coming down, especially for storage. And that is likely to continue. So I'm super bullish on this space. And I'm not alone in that thinking. I think most of the money management folks and the folks who lend into the space are mindful of that. But we're in a very tumultuous time. So you've got this very short-term window of a lot of instability and a lot of perceived risk that we have to get through. Once we're through it, I think, not that it's going to be, 2022 again, but I think we're back in like a 2020, 2021 kind of upward sloping curve that's going to be a lot more stable. But we do have to cross this, Rubicon of sort of difficult times to get there. So traditional sage advice, which, minimize debt, conserve equity, get rid of fixed expense. If you can reform the way you sell, if you can get W-2 salespeople to take direction, and that's where you want to be. I don't think you want to be super dependent on outside sources of revenue. I know that's sort of contraband to even say it out loud, but if you externalize that and you're dependent upon flow from external sources, there's risk associated with that, right? Now, if you're in multi-geographies and you're big, you're in that boat, you can't necessarily get out of it, right? But then you have to manage cost, right? So it's keep your warehousing expenses down, keep your best crews, like don't lose people. People are really expensive to replace. Good installers are like, for me, good salespeople. Like, you lose them, it paralyzes you, it hurts you. So it's sort of all your basic motherhood and apple pie stuff, right? But I think this is not a great time to take a lot of balance sheet risk. I think we got to be conservative for a while, and we got to tread water and sort of get back to basics of selling. And when this wears off, which it will, we're in a much better position to grow.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm telling my internal team is we just have to be prepared for a 30 to 50% drop in demand on the solar and the battery side in 2026. It's going to come back, going to gradually come back in 2027. I think by 2028, we're going to be right where, we were in 2024, which is a robust market. And also, I'm encouraging our teams and my friends to diversify a little bit. If you're just doing solar and batteries, maybe you can, do some EV chargers or panel upgrades and things like that. And that effectively reduces the customer acquisition cost, because once you have that customer for one product, you've got them for more. Okay, let's transition a little bit more. What should residential and commercial customers be thinking about as they're thinking about solar, battery storage, and picking companies to work with?
Well, I think it's really important. I think, reference checking is obvious, right? I mean, it's funny we have this discussion today. I won't name any names, but so I leased a little office space from a local landlord that I just have at least like a 300 square foot little space. And he knows I'm in the solar business. I hadn't seen him for a while, so I bumped him in the hallway, and he's having a huge problem with the 200 kW system he put on the building, and just went through. And he didn't come to me to ask my advice in buying the system. And I reminded him, I say, hey, you didn't come to me on this. I would have coached you better. And but look at this system is physically moving on his rooftop. It is a ballast mounted system. It should have been hard mount on the rooftop. Just a bad design. And he got it from an installer that we didn't really have in our ecosystem that has had problems in the market. So look, this is just one more example, right? It's like when you're hiring a person, right? You want a reference check, right? You want to ask around. I think some of the online reviews can be manipulated a little bit. I've seen it times. I mean, not totally. They're a good source. It's better than no source, right? But I think reference checking, hard reference checking is really important. It's probably easier to do on commercial installs because they're larger, and you'll probably get an owner that's invested a lot of money that's happy to actually tell you a story. But I think that's essential right now. If I'm a homeowner, I'm asking a lot of questions of my installer, and hey, who else have you sold to, and how do they like their system, and can I talk to them? Who's responsive? Who just, it's sort of the motherhood and apple pie. Do they tell you the truth? Do they show up on time? Do they, do words and pictures match up? I mean, those are sort of your obvious tells in any selling process, right? And that personal credibility of the salesperson, means something. Yeah, beyond that, I mean, this is a great year to try to buy this stuff because you still have 25D, and so if you could get it in this year, it's awesome. If you're not fixed on owning your system and, leasing it or having a PPA arrangement with a TPO is amenable to you, those economics are still going to be in place next year. So don't feel like you have to have it this year. You might actually get a better deal into Q1 or Q2 of next year because, pricing might drop a little bit, right? Because I think people are very, very busy right now. Crews are kind of overbooked. You might want to wait to buy a TPO system sort of into Q1 or Q2 of next year. You might see a better number.
That's interesting. All right. Any other general advice, whether for contractors or potential customers?
Well, I'd say for the contractors, we just got to keep the faith, right? Again, I'll shamelessly, promote my company. Use this as a resource for those folks listening that are our customers. Lean on your local folks. They're probably going to be asking a lot of questions. We're trying to forecast how much inventory do we need, how much credit bandwidth do we have to secure from our parent company to support our customers next year for their purchases, right? So we're going into a planning session this year that's sort of largely predicated on what our customers tell us. So I'd say, be prepared for, probably a lot of Q&A from our sales folks and our managers and our credit people. But, we're doing it with, I guess, two ends in mind. One, we want to resource our businesses better, but we also, look, a lot of our better installers, they're just heads down installing systems all day, right? That's what they do. They sell stuff and they put stuff on roofs, and they're not looking at all this complexity and all this crazy stuff that we have to worry about and what the government's saying and, what Customs and Border Patrol are hanging up and not allowing in this country for, that's our problem to deal with. So I think in some cases we're finding they haven't thought about their 2026 plan yet, right? They're going to cross that bridge kind of when they come to it, which I'm respectful of because they run the business, it's their business. I would say that this is a time where there'll be a lot of discontinuity. And so I think putting some time and energy into thinking about what next year is going to look like in your local market and how are you going to maintain your rate of sales origination in a really different financial environment? And are you onboarded with the right TPO players that you're going to need? We can help you with that. We have relationships with all of them, right? And then If you thought about your inventory needs and, if you are TPO, we got to line up that TPO's AVL. I got to make sure I have supply lined up for you. So sort of the back end planning of the supply chain equation happens sort of after people look forward and say, how much stuff am I going to sell next year, right? And trying to be realistic about that is hard. Nobody wants to say the market's going to be off 10 or 15 or 20 or God forbid 30% next year. But look, our view is in some markets, it's going to have to almost be there by definition, right? If we don't have TPO and we have cheap power, those markets could be off 30, 40%. And we just got to get ready for that. We don't want our customers to sort of blindly walk into it, have a lot of fixed expense exposure, a lot of inventory exposure, expect that, this time will be different and we'll kind of fight our way through it. We'd much rather coach folks to be conservative and lean on us to help you be conservative and, preserve your cash and your balance sheets so we come out of this thing stronger, in 6 or 10 months down the road.
And Dan, that's exactly where, I'm a big fan of distribution. It allows you to clean up your balance sheet. You don't have as much inventory. You have better cash flow. And then you just look at operational issues like you don't need as much warehouse space. I no longer have a purchasing department. It's just what's on GreenTech's list, and those are really good products, and that's what we're going to use. And so that really, really streamlined things. Okay. What do you do for fun? You're working intensely hard now on distribution, but how do you decompress?
How do I take the edge off? Well, I got 4 kids. I got triplets that are 19, so they're all in school, and then my oldest is 22. So they're all away from home. We're super involved parents, so we travel out to see them on a regular basis. They're all home for summer, which is great. Yeah, I'm pretty avid workout fiend, so I'm in the gym pretty much daily. I play a fair amount of golf. Do a little fishing from time to time. Not as good as my kids, but I try to keep up. Solar's kind of full time. Even when I'm doing that stuff, I swear to God, I'm thinking about solar all the time. It's a very addictive business, right? It sucks us all in and we can't escape. And I kind of feel like I'm on that treadmill.
Yeah. I'm the same way. And the exercise is really kind of helps take the pressure off. Okay. How can people get in touch with GreenTech Renewables?
Well, we are prominently out there on the web. I know we have 105, 106 locations. So we do have a good web presence. I would start there. And I guess if you get stuck, I don't see how we would though. We have a pretty good funnel. I would say most folks who are listening can probably find their local GreenTech. If you can't, we have a national website. And I think it's, cedgreenTech.com or greentechrenewables.com. You'll find us. If you can't get to us that way, ask any supplier. Enphase can get you to us. SolarEdge can get you to us. Enstall, Iron Ridge get you to us. They all know who we are and where to find us.
All right. That's terrific. Thanks for all the time we have on this week's Energy Show. And Dan, thanks for joining me. Really, really great insights. And thanks to all of our listeners for tuning in. If you missed any of today's show, you can always go to our website at energyshow.biz and listen to the podcasts.